With our definition of comics being pictorial storytelling, or telling a story strictly through the images, we can look back through history and see a lot of surprising things. Going back as far as we can to some of the oldest art in the world, the famous cave paintings at La Sceaux, France, roughly 17,000 years ago. Here we have animals up on the walls, including in the right corner the 100-point buck, which is kind of a cool image right there. While these are clearly images, we don't really have enough context, the term meaning the things that go with the text, straight from the Latin. So the context of why these were painted. Are these trophy animals, kind of what they've killed, or just spirits of the herd? We don't quite know on this one, but if we fast forward a few thousand years, we can see Jebel in the Caucasus. This cave painting here does show a story. We can clearly see some kind of cool triangular stick figure shapes. And several of them are standing here in the middle with spears and torches, and others are driving a chariot. Meanwhile, we have a few down on the ground laying without weapons. And here, enough context we can tell. This is a battle, and it's very much one-sided. So all of this just from a singular image, and if we had a little bit more context here, we could also tell what the whole story was. But we do have enough to give us a protagonist, whether it's the invaders or maybe this was drawn as the people fleeing from these armies. Either way, we get a plot of don't be the people without weapons. Fast forwarding a couple of more thousand years, we can go look at ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Here we have on this bottom panel a group of men carrying a casket and several personal items, as well as a group of women and children wailing into the sky. And we can clearly tell this is a funeral procession. Even though we're 5,000 years difference, we can still tell what's going on. A very cool thing about Egyptian hieroglyphics, up at the top they would accompany the images with words to explain in more detail. Just like today, we have comics that have images, but then you'll also get word balloons and narration and captions that will tell you a little bit more about what's going on in this whole. As a quick aside to Egyptian hieroglyphics, we could talk a little bit about the cuneiforms, so these images that are related to sounds that later build words. Also ideograms, another form of an image directly pertaining to a singular word. And some of these might be seen as comics, but as language gets more complex, the images become more symbolic. And rather than the story being told directly through the images, now it's a symbol which represents a word, and that word is built with other words to give us a completely different image. So you might not consider this a comic, mainly because all of those images are pertaining to certain sounds to build words. In the ancient world, we can see not only paintings of comics, but in fact entire sculptures pieced together to show an entire event. So here's a piece of the famous Elgin marbles. These used to stand at the top of the Parthenon in Athens. And these were telling a story all through these different bas-relief, all the way around the temple, of the time that Athens was invaded by centaurs. And it's kind of an interesting story, because the Athenians don't win the battle very well. These marauding monsters come in, and they fight and just destroy the Athenians, but the Athenians rally and manage to drive them off. Which you think that would be kind of a weird thing to commemorate, but that Parthenon was the top of the hill, the last defensive point of the city. So as people potentially being invaded look up and see this battle of our grandfathers literally fought off monsters and were okay, so we could probably take these Persians too. Fast forwarding a couple of hundred more years, we can get up to ancient Roman graffiti. So rather than these being images that are conducted by pharaohs or city officials in Athens, these are just the everyday person scratching something into the wall. Here is a piece of graffiti from the Colosseum. Somebody sat there with a pointy stick long enough to carve out this entire cartoon showing battle between Severus and Albanus. So, which we have a score of Severus 13, Albanus at least 169 points. So clearly an Albanus fan, and we even have Severus here running off, potentially screaming, judging from the wide space of his mouth. Moving ahead another 1,000 years, we can get to tapestries, such as the famous Bayeux Tapestry. Here we had the story of William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke, moving in to become King of England by conquest. Normally, countries don't like being conquered by other people, but England needed a king, and he appealed to the Pope, who said, yeah, you can be king. He just needed the people to agree to it. And a good way to do that is through force. So just like those paintings on the caves in northern Iran that we saw earlier, here we have men on horseback with spears, but we do have defenders wearing chainmail and carrying these long axes that the Angles of England had at the time. As recorded here, those axes don't do too much against the medieval tank of the charger horse with lances. William the Conqueror was successful. He still had to control the populace, and so he hired out a group of nuns to make this extensively long tapestry that was kept all rolled up. Technically, it's embroidery, but it does tell a story as we go from piece to piece. And here we see his portrait of William the Magnificent, according to the captions at the top. We also see all kinds of little fun bits, such as the minstrels who are performing while people are getting ready for having this big victory dinner. And down at the bottom, the Latin talks about the Episcopus from Pope Benedict, which is his letter guaranteeing that he will be King of England for all time. Moving on 400 years from there, we get to what are called cartoons. So we're going to have 3 definitions for the word cartoon. We already have one as a single panel comic. Another definition of cartoon you might hear is the typical Saturday morning animation. So a short animation is called a cartoon. But in these times, when Raphael was painting, a cartoon was kind of a preliminary sketch. It's a little blueprint that you make before you make the full thing. So the famous Renaissance painter Raphael, he was hired by his good friend the Pope to do a series of cartoons, these single paintings, which would later be turned into tapestries that were going to be sent around Europe on tour, kind of showing the actions of Christ and the apostles. So an interesting thing about tapestries is that they are woven, and so the image is actually backwards as you build it. By this point, we've already seen kind of a language coming up in art. You start from the left and read to the right, and you watch where the lighting is, and that gives you extra details that are kind of encoded into the message of the painting. Since this is backwards, we start from the right, and we see this first painting of the famous Ananias and Sapphira story from the book of Acts, where this couple sold a field and said that they had donated all the money to the church, but St. Peter questioned them, and Ananias and both Sapphira were struck down when they answered in a lie. So going back to the right, we see people giving to the church. St. Peter is raising his hand, questioning, and down below him we see this yellow-skinned Ananias, and he is just crumpling down there, struck dead, which the people surrounding him on kind of surprised on the right, and then very surprised and shocked on the left, are horrified by this lie about how much they give to the church. Which, completing the story, we keep panning over to the left, and we see what those gifts are doing. They're going to people who are needing help. So the moral of that story is don't lie about it. In another Raphael painting, we see the miraculous catch. Disciples out there on the Sea of Galilee gathering fish after fishing all night and not catching anything. This carpenter walks over and says, hey, you should try over there, and so they do, and catch so many fish that the nets start to fall apart and the boats start to sink. And as we read from right to left, we see St. Andrew and St. Peter both very grateful, and of course Jesus on the far left saying, don't worry about it, this is what I do to take care of my people. Here we have kind of this fantasy scape with castles and crowds watching and birds, which Raphael, of course, never traveled to Galilee and had no idea what it would look like. And so we have these Crusader-style castles instead of the leftover Roman fortifications that are actually standing there. But who is going to have traveled to Israel and come back and see this and enough to question him? Nobody. Speaking of artistic license, we can look at this painting by Raphael of St. Peter preaching to the Athenians, and reading from right to left, since it's backward, we see in the forefront with the light the people who accept the message and are so happy, and then a little bit darker, the people who are still pondering it and things, and then in the dark, the people who are laughing and arguing, and then finally coming back around to the people who are thinking again with the message of, well, do you want to be the people in the dark or the light? The artistic license comes from the Pantheon standing in the back. Very famous temple in Rome, which was later converted into a church, and Raphael considered it the most perfect building in the world. He even petitioned to be buried in there, and to this day you can go visit the Pantheon and see Raphael buried inside. But that's in Rome, not in Athens. Even so, he wanted to paint it, and so he painted it, and I guess nobody questioned it. As the Renaissance turned into the Enlightenment, we got more and more encoding into art, which we'll see as we explore these Enlightenment paintings. Also showed a big growth of the middle class, and from this middle class, we found not just singular patrons, such as the Pope or Pharaoh or King William the Conqueror, but people could kind of crowdsource their art. So we're going to look at paintings by William Hogarth, who got started as a woodcarver and a portrait painter. So initially he would go around paint pictures of rich people because they had money and they could give it to them. But as the printing press became more and more complex and available, he started doing series of woodcuts, this sequential art that would tell stories. And he did these big moral stories like The Rake, about a young man who decides to take his inheritance early and goes out and blows it on partying, and then he dies. So the lesson of that is don't do that. People love this idea of sequential art. It's comic books, but in the 1730s and 1750s. Start the story with one image and gradually see those characters progress as the story goes on. A shot of William Hogarth here, a self-portrait with his dog, which, as much as people like dog pics today online, they definitely loved him in the 18th century. And now we're going to look at one of his most famous collections called Marriage a la Mode. So this is a series of several paintings, all telling a singular story, called Marriage a la Mode, after the famous phrase a la mode, which means of the day or of the fashion, so fashionable times. Also, it means with ice cream, which is another big product of the Age of Enlightenment. They finally got things complex enough for ice storage houses and importing sugar so you could make ice cream. So, Marriage a la Mode ends with the introduction of the young gentleman who's kind of aloof, doesn't really know where he is. He's just teasing around doing what he has to do. He is an aristocrat, but not very well off, other than some famous paintings in the background. And he is getting married to a young lady who's the daughter of an industrialist, so somebody with money. And that's what's making it this fashionable marriage, is we're propping up the old upper class with the new upper class of these people who are building factories. The young lady's not very interested in this idea. You can see her wringing her handkerchief there, but the lawyers are talking her into it. And of course, the fathers are over there constructing the business deal. We have her father looking over all the banknotes and making sure this is a good deal, and his father showing off their famous family tree, going all the way back to some knight hilariously moving out of the trunk of his body into the trunk of the tree. You can also see tucked under the table, the aristocrat has gout, famously a rich person's disease back then. It's a byproduct of having a very rich diet, and back then you had to be rich to afford that. Now, lots of folks have gout, and it is a very painful and unfortunate disease. But in this time, you had to be very fortunate to get it, and so Hogarth pokes a little fun at that and says, he looks like he's all well-to-do, but once you start looking a little bit deeper, he's just injuring himself. In the second panel, called the Théâtre, this is after the wedding. So we see the minister with all the paperwork walking off. He's just done for the night. We see instruments strewn around. Behind him, there's a servant trying to clean up and scratching under his wig, which is pretty hilarious. And meanwhile, we see a little bit of character development. The young lady's looking at the young man and she thinks, he's a pretty good-looking fella. He might be a pretty good beau here. And meanwhile, he's just passed out. He still has no idea where he is or what he's doing. Even to the point where dogs are going through his pockets, and he doesn't even wake up enough to notice. One reason he's so tired is seen here in the third panel, the inspection, where we get the introduction on the left side of a skull, so something death has happened, and an apothecary's assistant who is being visited by the young man and one of the servant girls. So she's wrapped up in his cape and weeping, and clearly they've been carrying on and done some things they shouldn't have, and now baby's on the way, and he can't have that, of course, so he goes over to the local apothecary and pays what he has to do to get these things taken care of, which he doesn't mind. He's all smiles and not even looking at her. Instead, he's looking over at that assistant, who, from the marks on her face, we can clearly tell has syphilis. Meanwhile, at the toilet, the young lady is bringing all her friends over. She's enjoying being part of the formal upper class. and having guys sing and play the flute, and I don't know what's going on with this guy's hair with all the white stuff sticking up, but it looks awesome. Meanwhile, she's hanging out with that lawyer from before, and they're talking and chatting a little bit, and as we see a lot of the art in the background and the horned man image in the foreground, those are all images of philandry and erotic power, so clearly building to something problematic. In panel number 5, the Bagnio, which is Italian for the fight. So the empty bed with askew sheets and the adulterous lawyer running out the window. So she begs for forgiveness. Meanwhile, we see what exactly happened with a bloodied sword on the floor and the young man standing there wounded. What we can assume is that he came home from his philandering, found out she was philandering, and of course challenged his fellow to a duel, which you shouldn't do if you're not good at dueling. He clearly lost. And now everyone's bursting in to see what all the hubbub is about, thus proving that those who do bad things, even in the quiet and dark, will be revealed. And in this final panel, the lady's death, we see that lawyer from before pulling the ring from her finger as the lady's dead of syphilis that she's caught from the young man's from his philandering, and their daughter's being pulled off her, trying to weep. And meanwhile, the house is just falling apart, even to the point where we can see a starving dog stealing food off the table on the right-hand side. So big moral questions here. A lot of people said, oh, this is pornographic and shouldn't be shown, but Hogarth made a lot of money. He set up a studio where people could come in, and in this gallery, he would have all 6 paintings line up, and you'd pay a penny, and you'd come and look at all those, and it was kind of like watching E! We'd see all these super rich people being goofy toward each other and ultimately failing, and it was just kind of fun to have a laugh, and then you'd go back to your everyday middle-class life working hard. Thus, we can see that sequential art has not been a new thing by any means. This is 260 years ago. Nor is storytelling through pictures anything new either. Lots of folks have been portraying stories through those going back